Good day, everyone. Our lesson for today is about the cellular basis of life. We know that cells are important components of every living organism. Thus, this lesson provides a thorough discussion of how a cell is defined, what different cell types of cells are found in all living organisms, how each of these cells evolved from the very first true cells, and what components are found inside these cells and their specific functions. So at the end of this lesson, you will be able to define a cell, differentiate the basic cell types, and trace the evolution of the different cell types. So before we begin our discussion, let me give you these three picture puzzles. Please find the missing piece in each of the following picture puzzle. So for this part here, this is a snail. So which of the five choices is the missing puzzle? How about for the dolphin here? Now which one is the missing puzzle? How about in this picture, no, a cactus? Which one no, is the missing puzzle? So do you think each of the pieces of this puzzle is important? Just like that of a puzzle, our cells are the pieces that make us what we are. Thus, cell is regarded as the basic unit of life. Now, the term cell was coined by Robert Hooke based on his microscopic observation of a piece of cork. So, a cork is is a material which is made up of plant cells. Okay, and this is Robert Hooke. So if you notice here, no example of a living organism is a human, and humans are made up of these different types of cells. That's why the cell is regarded as the basic unit of life. Now, the universally accepted definition of a cell is postulated in the cell theory, or more commonly, it is called as the modern cell theory. The cell theory states that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. Now, we always emphasize this phrase one or more cells because if, as you have known in your previous biology courses, there are also organisms that are unicellular or made up only of a single cell. So they're called unicellular organisms or single-celled organisms. Okay, so all organisms are composed of one or more cells. The unicellular and those that contain more cells are called the multicellular organisms. Another postulate of the cell theory is that cells are the units of organization of all organisms. No? So just like in our society, we know that the family is the basic unit of society. So in every living organism, the basic unit of life, as what we defined earlier, are the cell. Because the cells are the one that is being organized to become an organism. So if we look into the level of organization of a living organism, we know that from the macromolecules, the organelles, basic cell structures are produced, and the cells are produced. Now, each of the cells are now the basic components of a living organism. These cells will now group according to their function to form different types of tissues. Different types of tissues will now form an organ with a specific function. And different organs now form different organ systems, and different organ systems will now form an organism. Okay, so cells are the units of organization of all organisms. And the third postulate is that cells arise only from pre-existing cells, at least in the modern times. Because if we take a look back at the evolution of a single cell, so we could be stating a different approach for that, which we will talk about later on when we go to the evolution. But in the modern times, we know that cells arise only from pre-existing cells. So if you notice here in this animated video, animated picture, one cell divides and forms two new cells. So the the present type of cells is believed to have evolved from the Luca, no? Or the last universal common ancestor. And this is proposed by Wolfram Zille. No? So he said, the present cellular forms on Earth have evolved from the last universal common ancestor, the Luca, which are also otherwise known as prokaryotes. So the Luca is the very first true cell. This is a single cell organism that is believed to be the origin of all life on Earth. Now, I will not be talking about the evolution of the very first two cells in detail because that will be discussed later on in evolutionary biology. Now, from the very first two cells, how does the basic types of cells evolve? Okay, so this is now the grammatical representation of how the present type of cells, the prokaryotic cells and the eukaryotic cells evolved from uh, the last universal common ancestor. So some time ago, a progenote or the Luca, the very first two cells to evolve, has undergone a spatial separation. So when you say spatial, no, not special, it's spatial, spatial, meaning there is separation in space. Okay? Spatial separation. So some of these progenotes were separated. No, the progenotes were separated. Some in one big stayed in one place, others go to another place. Now these places may be of different conditions, environmental conditions, and we know for a fact that conditions really affect how a particular entity evolves. So because of the differences in the conditions, during as the progenotes were separated, some of the progenotes in one place evolved and became the pre uh, the pre-bacterium, okay, under the pre-archaean here, and others evolved and became the pre-bacterium. Later on, they evolved, the pre-archaeans evolved to become specific, to have specific cell membranes. Others evolved to have the pre-bacterium also evolved to have specific cell membranes as well. However, sometime during the evolution, some of these pre-archaean and some of these pre-bacterium met each other and fused. Okay, so their fusion created a different type of uh, cell. This is now called a pre-eukaryotic cell. Ganun wala man siya nahimong progenote balik because they have already undergone different types of evolution. So their fusion has created another type of a cell. This is now called a pre-eukaryotic cell, which later on evolved and became the eukaryotic cell. Now, some of those pre-archaean that did not fuse with a prebacterium evolved later on and became the true archaeal cells, while the other prebacterium also, which did not fuse with the pre-archaean, evolved and later became the true bacterial cells. So at this point, a eukaryotic cell is now formed, and the remaining archaeal and the bacterial cells are now representative prokaryotic cell. So that's how the present types of cells, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes, evolved from the last universal common ancestor. So if you look at this uh, phylogenetic construction of how these different type of cells are related to each other, since the archaeal cell has more advanced evolution during the fusion, eukaryotic cells are more similar to archaea than bacterial cells. Okay? So from these eukaryotic cells, we know that there are different types of eukaryotic cells as of the present. Now, as a eukaryotic cell differ from a prokaryotic cell. Okay? So this is a theoretic representation of a eukaryotic cell. Well, this is a representation of a prokaryotic cell. These are an actual prokaryotic cell, while this is an actual image of a eukaryotic cell. Now, the main difference is that in eukaryotic cell, the genetic material is actually enclosed by a nuclear membrane, making it distinct from the rest of the other cellular materials, so that it creates the nuclear environment. So this is now what we call the nucleus. Now, genetic material that is enclosed in a membrane called the nuclear membrane, now making it distinct from the rest of the cellular materials. While in prokaryotic cells, the genetic material is not enclosed by a membrane. So it is not distinct from the rest of the cellular materials. Okay? So you have here a distinct nucleus. Here, you don't have a distinct nucleus. Instead, the nuclear material is found in a region of the cell called the nucleoid. Aside from the presence of a distinct nucleus, in eukaryotic cells, other organelles or most of the cellular structures are also membrane bound. No? Like this one here, this also here. So they have membranes. So they are also distinct from the rest of the cellular material. Unlike here, where everyone it's just like in a mixed inside the bacteria, inside the prokaryotics. So that's the main, or those are the main differences between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. So if you notice here in this image, now this is a plant cell which is stained for uh, the presence of the genetic material. So the pink here, if you notice, there are mostly of them at the center. So those are the nucleus. Unlike here, the genetic material is stained for the blue color one. If you notice, they are all over inside the each of the prokaryotic cell. So there is no distinction inside the cell whether that is uh, genetic material or other cellular material. So from that eukaryotic cells that evolved from the Luca, how does the different types of eukaryotic cells evolve? So we know now that as of the present, there are several types of eukaryotic cells. The plants and the algae, the animal cells, the fungal cells, the protist cells. These are all types of eukaryotic cells. So do they or how did they evolve from the very first eukaryotic cell? Now, a theory that is proposed by Lynn Margulis is called the Endosymbiotic theory or symbiogenesis, which explains the evolution of the different eukaryotic cells from the very first eukaryotic cells. So after the formation of these first eukaryotic cells, uh, these pre-eukaryotic cells has sometimes during its feeding has encountered a proteobacteria. A proteobacteria is a respiring bacteria, meaning they could use organic or inorganic sources to produce their own energy. So these proteobacteria, respiring bacteria, was engulfed by a pre-eukaryotic organism. Okay? However, after engulfing or after phagocytosis, this proteobacteria was not digested and instead survived inside the cell. Later on, the pre-eukaryotic cell provided a conducive environment for the reproduction and survival of this type of bacteria. So it later became a symbiont of this pre-eukaryotic cell and later on evolved and became the mitochondrion of the pre-eukaryotic cells. These pre-eukaryotic cells that already contained a mitochondrion is now called a protoctista. Okay? Now, these protoctista are the ones that gave rise, later on it gave rise to the protist cells. There are animal-like protists. Also also plant-like protists as well. There are also fungal cells and animal cells. However, some of these Protoctista has once again encountered another type of bacteria called a cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria is a phototrophic bacteria or a photosynthetic bacteria. So they produce energy and produce organic compounds via photosynthesis. So after phagocytosis, or after the phagocytosis of um, cyanobacteria by the Protoctista, it once again did not, or the Protoctista was not able to digest the cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria survived inside the Protoctista cell, and the cell provided a good environment for the growth and reproduction of this type of bacteria. Later on, the bacteria no, became a symbiont and evolved to become the chloroplast of the plant cell. So if you notice during the evolution, there are two main events. The prokaryotic that has engulfed a proteobacteria, forming the protoctista. Protoctista engulfed the cyanobacteria, forming the chloroplast, evolved and became the plant cells. So this is how the different types of eukaryotic cells were formed. Now the question is this true? Do we agree with this theory? If this is true, what evidences support this? Okay, so as of the present, this theory is the most acceptable uh, in terms of how the different types of eukaryotic cells now are formed. Now, what evidence support this? Now, studies have shown that the genome of cyanobacteria is similar to that of the present chloroplast no genome. The presence no, of genome itself inside the chloroplast and inside the mitochondria is also a clear evidence that they are once a free living organism. Because aside from the nucleus, our mitochondria in plural, also have their own genetic material. And in plant cells, their chloroplasts also have genetic material. Aside from that, the genetic material of chloroplast and mitochondrion are circular in structure, unlike the eukaryotic no, genetic material, which is linear. So that circular genetic material is consistent with the structure of a prokaryotic cell. Also, the same with the proteobacteria and cyanobacteria, the chloroplast and mitochondrion now have their own they have their own membranes as well. Okay, and also another important evidence is that the mitochondria and chloroplast are capable of replication and they're capable of reproduction, so they can reproduce. They can double or they can increase their number inside a particular cell. Okay, so those are the different evidence that support this claim. This could probably be true. This could be how the different types of eukaryotic cells have evolved from the very first eukaryotic cells. So what are those again? So the presence of the genetic material itself inside the chloroplast and mitochondrion, the structure of their genetic material, which is circular, the same with a prokaryotic cell. The genomic content are the same with that of prokaryotic cell. They're capable of replication, and they are membrane bound as well. Now, in summary, I will give you these different summary questions. So, what is a cell? What are the statements of the cell theory? What are the basic types of cells and how do they differ from each other? And how did the present type of cells evolve from the last universal common ancestor? So, in order for you to review the key concept of this lesson, now you should be able to answer these different summary questions. Thank you very much. See you again in our next lesson. So if you have any question, feel free to ask. With this is my contact information. You could also raise your question about the topic in the forum in our VSU e-learning environment or the VSU e-learning portal. You could also raise your questions in our official group chat. Once again, thank you and see you in our next discussion.